Okay, welcome everybody. I'm so excited to host everyone on this platform of scientific stories, diving into the sea of knowledge. My name is Reem Al-Mualla and I am a coral reef ecologist. I major in marine biology and recently completed my PhD in marine ecology. So I am so excited to introduce you all to Dr. Greta Abbey, who is a coral disease ecologist. She is an American researcher working on coral disease here in the Gulf. And I am so excited to be able to share with you her amazing research and for her to be here. So thank you, Greta, for your time and your efforts. And we all look forward to learning from you about coral disease in the Gulf. And I just will hand over this to you and tell us some more about your research.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Coral reefs are very important ecosystems and they need all the help they can get from us humans. So I'm always very happy to share any knowledge that I have with others. And as way of my background, I got my PhD from Hawaii and later established a research lab there. So I've been researching coral disease in the ecology of coral diseases in Hawaii, throughout the Indo-Pacific, in Florida, and now in the Middle Eastern region. So I've been looking at the health of coral reefs in a lot of areas of the world. And today I would like to share with you some basic information about coral reefs and what disease is in corals, and then some more specific information about the health of the coral reefs in the Arabian Gulf. Not a lot of work has been done here yet, but we're hoping to get more and more people on board researching and finding out about these great ecosystems you guys have here. You're very lucky. All right, so today we will talk a little bit about corals, coral health, and corals and the health of corals in the Arabian Gulf. So we'll start with the basics about corals. Coral reefs are amazing ecosystems that are very diverse and biologically productive. There are a myriad of animals that depend on these coral reef structures to provide their homes, their food, shelter, and the other animals that depend on those as their food items. So there's about 25% of the total animals that live in the ocean that need a healthy coral reef in order to exist. So that's pretty important stuff there for our ecosystem. On top of that, coral reefs not only produce these structures for all the other little animals, but they're very important for us humans. So these structures out in the ocean, these reefs protect our shoreline. So they attenuate the wave energy so the waves don't wash our shores and homes away. They support our fisheries, tourism, they replenish our beach sand. And in fact, looking at the economic value of coral reefs worldwide, we're talking about billions of dollars. So it's not only ecologically important, but economically important to maintain healthy coral reefs. So what are these coral reefs? How are they produced, these apparently very valuable ecosystems? Well, these structures are actually made by very simple coral animals called polyps. And each polyp has tentacles and a mouth, and one polyp is connected to its brother or sister through this little canal here. So this is what the little coral polyps look like underwater. You can see their tentacles in their mouth. And all of these coral polyps together make a coral colony. And all of these different coral colonies make up what we call the coral reefs. Now, corals are animals, how do they eat? Well, corals eat in two different ways. One, they have nematocysts or stinging cells in their tentacles, and they sting little tiny zooplankton in the ocean, and they'll swallow that down their mouth and feed on that. But most of the energy actually comes from this partnership or symbiosis between these small little single-celled algae that actually live in the tissue of the coral animal or the coral polyp. And these algae will photosynthesize like all plants do and share that energy with the coral animal. And in fact, 90% of the coral's food comes from this partnership or symbiosis with the algae. So that's how they feed, that's how they grow. What do we need to maintain healthy coral reefs? Well, first off, we need clean, clear water, because those zooxanthellae, that algae, needs light in order for them to be able to photosynthesize and feed the coral. And they also need low nutrient water so that algae does not grow overly fast and grow over and smother the coral. And also, since algae does grow so much faster, they need grazing by fish and invertebrates, so animals that eat that algae, to keep that controlled. So that's what we need for a healthy coral reef. That's it. Very simple. So how are we humans doing on this? Well, unfortunately, we also like to live next to the ocean. And so human use and coastal development has created a number of problems, such as nutrient runoff. You have all these things that anything that's put on the land is going to run off into the water. And you get situations like this, that lower right picture, where you have eutrophication and blocking the light, excess nutrients, creating these algae blooms. And when it rains or have other issues, you have sedimentations that will run off and smother the coral reefs. And then you have different types of pollution, such as the desalination plants that occur out here in the Gulf. Now, we also said that you need animals that will crop back that seaweed so it won't smother the coral. And unfortunately, we like to harvest those same animals for food. So over-harvesting or overfishing is also a problem for reefs, coral reefs worldwide. On top of these local pressures, coral reefs are facing problems with global climate change. Now, what we see here is a map put out by NOAA that shows the world's oceans and how warm they are. And this shows the darker the red color, the hotter that water is. And this was from a 2014 to 17 heating event that happened, as you can see, worldwide. Lots of red, meaning it's much hotter than what we're used to in these regions. And what that warm water leads to is coral bleaching. Now, bleaching is a loss of that symbiotic algae. You can see that these little flower things are coral polyps. You see the tentacles, the mouth, but they're not colored anymore because that algae that normally would give them their brown color has left, and it leaves these corals extremely hungry. So if they stay bleached, then the corals don't have the energy to grow or reproduce, make babies. And if they stay bleached long enough, they will die. And also, as they're made very vulnerable because they're starving, they also increases their susceptibility to other diseases. And normally when we have mass bleaching events, it's in response to these elevated sea surface temperatures. Now, our first bleaching event was back in 1998, where we lost about 16% of the world's coral reefs. They died. And you can see all the white corals here. This was from a bleaching event in the Red Sea. We had a second mass bleaching in 2010 and another one that was extensive going from 2014 to 2017. And so the first one you see, there was a 12-year gap between 1998 and 2010. So that gave the coral reef some time to recover from this very harmful event. But you can see here, there was only 4 years that they were allowed to recover between the second and third. So what we're seeing is a decline in our reefs. And when we say global, we do mean global bleaching events. So everywhere you see red dots are coral reefs that bleached during that 2014 event. So we are talking global. Now, the other problem with global climate change is not just increased sea surface temperatures, but you also have changing weather patterns. You have more storm damage. You have more runoff going on to these coral reefs. And so along with these problems with more bleaching, you have more disease. So corals are animals. They get disease just like we get disease. So the standard definition of disease is when you have an impairment of the body function organ or system. Same with coral. Something is wrong in that coral. And that can be caused by biotic or infectious agents. So those are your bacteria and your viruses. But disease can also be caused by non-infectious or environmental. Just as we can get skin cancer from too much UV exposure from the sun. It's not infectious, you can't catch skin cancer, but you can still have a disease created by the environment. The same is true for corals. Now, disease in itself is not unusual. We all get sick. This disease is just one component of the ecosystem, that if you have a population and it's growing through time, at some point the environment can only hold so much of the organisms. So some processes are increasing the growth of whatever your population is, and other processes are decreasing the number of organisms, and disease is just one of those processes. Not a big deal, everybody gets sick. The problem arises when you have disease outbreaks or these increases in occurrence of a disease, such as we're having right now with COVID-19. That's an example of a disease outbreak that has just gone crazy. Now, for corals and disease, the first thing that you need to realize is that in order for us to know whether disease is increasing in a region or on a reef, you have to have done your basic baseline disease surveys. We'll talk about this a little bit more later, but a lot of areas of the world still do not even have their baseline surveys done. So that's a critical first step. Now, the harm that disease can create for coral reefs is exemplified by what is currently happening on the Florida Reef Tract. This brown areas are the healthy coral, and where you see white or light yellow, that is where the tissue has sloughed off, leaving the bare coral skeleton behind. And so what's happening in Florida is a tissue loss disease. We see progressive tissue loss. We know that a bacterial infection is involved in this outbreak, and it has just left reefs devastated by this disease, with large coral colonies completely killed from this disease. And the problem with that amount of mortality or death on corals is that corals grow back very slowly. Most corals only grow about, maybe about that much a year, and that's it. So when you're losing huge coral colonies to a disease outbreak, it's going to take decades and decades for them to recover. Just like if you burn a forest down, it takes a long time for those trees to grow back up. And this outbreak in Florida started around the Miami region in the United States, where you indicated by red here, in 2014. And since that time, we've just watched this disease spread. As you watch the red spreading, those are the areas that the disease started spreading to. 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, and it is still going on to today. So that outbreak is still killing corals across the Florida Reef Tract. And what we've got now are these severely degraded coral reefs in Florida. So this is a very sad scenario that we would like to avoid, if possible, in other areas of the world, such as the Arabian Gulf here. We want to avoid this if this is possible. But I don't want you to think that it was just disease that did this. These coral reefs have been damaged by poor water quality. You can see how green the water is in that picture. Over-harvesting of the fish that should be eating the seaweeds. And now you put disease on top of that, and we've got a collapsed ecosystem there. Unfortunately, although this started in Florida here at the top of the mat, everywhere you see a red star, the disease has now spread throughout the Caribbean, and it is really harming the coral reefs. Really pretty sad. So what we know about coral disease in general, that it's increasing worldwide. It caused extensive damage to reefs in Florida and now the Caribbean, and it's emerged as a problem in the Indo-Pacific. So what about here though? We're out here in the Arabian Gulf. How are our coral reefs doing out here? Well, first let's talk a little bit about the ocean conditions for corals in the Arabian Gulf. So we see the Arabian Gulf is a relatively shallow semi-enclosed sea with a very water flow restricted through the Strait of Hormuz. And this sea is surrounded by very dry, arid lands. And this creates a interesting or actually a stressful situation or extreme conditions for the corals that live in here. And being surrounded by all these hot, arid lands, we get extreme temperature fluctuations here that our corals have to be able to withstand. So this is showing the summertime pictures in the temperatures in the Gulf, and you see it's very hot inside the Gulf, but just outside in the Oman Sea, it's much cooler because there's an influx of the cooler water from the Indian Ocean that really doesn't get very far into the Persian Gulf. And the other thing that we have with these extreme temperatures is very high salinities because of evaporation. Water evaporates, the salt stays behind, and you have these very high salinities. Normal seawater salinities are more around 32 parts per thousand. So this is pretty salty water, and these are the conditions that the corals have to tolerate. But they do, there's a whole subset of corals. These are all Arabian corals that I have pictured here that can tolerate that. But you can see that in the Arabian Gulf that they have to withstand temperatures up to 35 degrees Celsius. Whereas an example, Hawaii, where I have done a lot of work, corals only have to tolerate temperatures up to 28. And you can see the salinities are much more moderate. So the corals in Hawaii have a much easier life. Their environment is much less extreme. And in fact, if you took a Hawaiian coral and you put them in these temperatures that we see regularly in the Arabian Gulf, they would die immediately. They couldn't tolerate. And so most of the corals that live in this stressful region in the Arabian Gulf actually have come from the Indo-Pacific region, predominantly the coral triangle. And you can see how many coral species are in this coral triangle region. And a small subset of those have actually been able to migrate up into the Gulf region and be able to survive in these harsher conditions. So there's the conditions our corals have to face on a regular basis. How are they doing health-wise in dealing with these very extreme conditions? So now we'll talk about coral disease on the reefs in the Arabian Gulf. And the first thing you'll see is that not a lot of work has been done. There's been, everywhere you see some black dots are a few studies that have been done in this region. And you see most of the work has been done in the United Arab Emirates, a little bit in Iran, and we are just starting up some studies here in Qatar. But you see, there are many areas that there's really almost nothing known about that. So that will be one of the critical first steps, is to get these baseline studies going. But from these few studies, I'll share what we know about coral health in this region. So when we go out to do a baseline study or a survey of coral disease, we want to ask some basic questions. What kind of diseases do you have out here in the Gulf? Is there a lot of disease? What proportion of your corals, or the term is disease prevalence, have it? Is it just a few corals like a normal disease, or do we have disease outbreaks like a COVID situation? How widespread are these different diseases? Are they everywhere or just a couple reefs? And which are your most vulnerable corals? Because usually you have different corals are really strong against disease. Others catch disease really easy. What are your corals here in the Gulf? And which sites are most affected? And this is going to start to tell you which environmental conditions are creating problems for your coral reefs out here. And are you having any disease outbreaks? Or are you still pretty good in terms of the proportion of your corals, just a few corals to get disease? So when we go out to do our baseline studies, we have all these questions that we're attempting to answer. So when we go out to do a survey, how do we know coral has disease? What do we look for? Well, coral, as I said, is a simple animal, and usually disease will show up in one of three types of lesions. Either they'll have tissue loss, and this creates the most harm, directly killing corals. And that tissue loss disease can be slow or it can be very fast. And the faster it is, the more death or mortality you have. But corals can also have discolorations that will create problems, like these pink spots are not normal on this brown coral, or they can actually get these tumors or growth anomalies here. And with the discolorations and growth anomalies, you usually get minimal death, and instead you've got reduction in coral growth or reduction in reproduction, which can be a problem for the coral reef environment as a whole, because as some corals are dying, you need the babies coming in to replace those corals. So what types of diseases have we been finding out here in the Arabian Gulf? Well, we get the tissue loss diseases. We have what we call white syndromes, which are progressive tissue loss diseases of unknown etiologies. We don't know what causes them yet. We have to do the research to understand these, but you can see the brown again is the area where there's still healthy tissue, and the white and the green is the area where the tissue has sloughed off from the disease. And these have been found affecting a number of different genera. We have black band disease, which again creates tissue loss, but this we do know the cause is caused by multiple bacterial infection that's dominated by this black filamentous cyanobacteria that will slowly kill the corals. And we know a lot about this one disease, and we know that it's most common in the summertime when the temperatures get really hot, leaving the corals more vulnerable to this disease. Now, this is a disease that I think is very unique to the Arabian Gulf. It's never been found elsewhere. And this is Parietes yellow banded tissue loss. Again, this is the healthy, the brown, and you can see the tissue is gone, and you can see this distinct yellow band right next to the healthy tissue. We don't know the etiology of this either, again, because it has not been studied. We need research out in these areas to understand this, but this is one of the unique tissue loss diseases found nowhere else in the world. You also have diseases with discoloration. You see these bleached patches here, very distinct, where the zooxanthellae have left, and that one area is pretty hungry. We don't know the etiology of these diseases out here. In other regions of the world, it's been found that these are caused by viral infections. Out here, we don't know. Again, the research needs to be done. And we did find quite a few corals that get these tumors or growth anomalies here. So those are the types of diseases we have in the Arabian Gulf. What about levels of disease? How many corals are affected? And I'll just give you some of the data from our studies. So in Qatar, you see that less than 0.5% of the corals that I looked at have disease. So that's good. That means that out here in the Arabian Gulf, you're ahead of the ball. You're not in a situation like Florida where you're already have major problems with disease. At UAE's reef, again, less than 1%. So that's good. Those are pretty normal levels for a healthy ecosystem. In Iran, this is just from one island, so that's a very small data set, but we found, and this is the person that did these studies here, Masa, a little higher disease levels, 3.6%, which is starting to get up there. But again, this was just one island, 4 survey sites. So there needs to be more surveys done in Iran before we get a better picture about how their reefs really are doing. What about distribution of the different diseases? Well, here, this is from Qatar, just to give you an example. And these are the different types of diseases along the side. And these are the different names of the sites across the top. And X just means the disease was there. And you can see some diseases like this Parietes focal bleaching, it was only found at one site. So that's not a disease that's very common. Maybe we don't need to worry about it. But growth anomalies in Dipsastrea, this type of coral, was much more common. So maybe that's an area that we want to focus our research in understanding why these corals get these tumors on that. In general, if you look at the literature in Qatar, the most common disease were the growth anomalies, especially in Dipsastrea. UAE, tissue loss diseases in a type of coral called Parietes, and growth anomalies in a type of coral called Platygyra. And at Kish Island in Iran, the tissue loss diseases in parietes again. So now we're starting to get an idea of what your more common diseases are in the Arabian Gulf. And which of your corals are most vulnerable? To look at this, we look at do our surveys. On the y-axis here, we look at disease prevalence, so what proportion of the corals were impacted. And on the x-axis, we see the different types of corals along the bottom. And a high bar indicates that there was a lot of disease. So for Qatar, this type of coral, or Platygyra, tends to get disease more than the others. Again, in general, from looking at the different surveys, in Qatar, as I said, it was this brain coral, Platygyra. UAE, also the brain coral, very vulnerable to diseases, and their acroporids, very vulnerable to diseases. And in Kish Island, it was parietes that were most vulnerable to any types of diseases. And in terms of sites, I'll just give you an example. This is from UAE. And again, disease prevalence on the y-axis and all the different sites across the bottom. And you can see some have very high bars there, and that indicates high disease, and some very low bars, meaning very low disease. And so you got to ask yourself why. What is it about Sadia that the corals tend to get disease more than, say, Delma, where the disease is very low? And if we can start to figure out the environmental conditions that are making the corals more sick, then those are the environmental conditions we could improve to improve the health of your corals. So there's strong management implications for trying to understand why these corals are getting disease. And so the last question is, are you having any disease outbreaks here in the Arabian Gulf? Well, even though in general, disease levels are fairly low, that's good. We are already starting to see problems with localized outbreaks. So this paper just came out in 2020 by Emily House and the group in Abu Dhabi, where they're seeing outbreaks of these tissue loss diseases or white syndromes in multiple genera, different types of corals. And they were seeing outbreaks occurring every summer in 2014, outbreak, some corals dying, and then it would go away in the winter, and then 2015 again in the summer, 2016 again. And they found that their acroporids were the most susceptible to this tissue loss disease, with up to 42% of the corals that they looked at dying from this disease. So this is a little worrisome that you're already starting to have these localized or small scale at one reef or two reef outbreaks. When we did our surveys, we also did it during the summer, and we also found in these regions localized outbreaks, both of that yellow banded tissue loss that's unique, the white syndromes like Emily's group found, and also the black band disease, which we know commonly will increase in the summer times. But even in Qatar, we did this survey in the wintertime where there was no hot temperature stress, and we still found Platygyra, that very vulnerable coral type, the brain corals, very vulnerable to disease. We found an outbreak at one site, even in the winter. So that definitely needs to be studied a lot more to figure out what's causing these diseases and what are the environmental conditions that are allowing it to become outbreak levels at these sites. So in summary, the types of diseases we found in the Arabian Gulf: tissue loss diseases of unknown etiology or white syndromes, black band disease, tumors, focal bleaching, and that yellow banded tissue loss, which was unique to the Gulf. Not to be confused with this other picture, you see also a yellow band, but very different disease in the Caribbean on that. We also found disease was widespread, but fortunately, it's at very low prevalence. In general, not many corals are sick, so that's good. We do have some corals that are more susceptible than others, and some sites or reefs that tend to get disease more than others. And unfortunately, we are starting to see this small scale disease outbreaks are starting to occur. So it's best if we get ahead of the ball, understand these diseases a lot more before we have any outbreaks. So what are our future? What do we need to protect the reefs in the Arabian Gulf? We've got to get those baseline disease surveys in. You can't know if your what diseases you have, or if the levels are changing, if you haven't done the baselines. And we need a lot more research on understanding the pathogens, the mode of transmission, the environmental conditions that are creating these diseases. We can go on to do regional comparisons to help us understand these disease dynamics and if they're spreading amongst the areas within the Gulf. And then I really encourage this region to develop the capacity to respond to any disease outbreaks rapidly so that you don't have a COVID-19 situation. So the countries that really clamped down, they were able to get the COVID numbers under control and contain it. And the countries that didn't, like my country, the US, did not clamp down, it's out of control. It's too late. So same thing with coral disease in Florida. That disease outbreak started in 2014. They didn't even start to respond for 3 years, not till 2017, and it had already spread too wide. So have a response plan, develop it, have it in place, train folks, and then you won't have the problems that Florida had. You can contain it quickly. And with that, thank you so much for listening. And I'm always open to further questions or communications. All right.
Thank you so much, Greta, for that. That was really an interesting talk, even for me. It always amazes me how much is there for us to learn and, you know, information to gather. And yes, and looking and listening to you and learning a bit more with you about the diseases that you found during your research with your colleagues brought to mind some of my observations when I was diving here in Bahrain. And seeing your slides has actually triggered a bit of my memory. And now I've realized I've actually seen the yellow-banded tissue loss disease that you said was unique to the Gulf in Bahrain. And I never knew what that was, but now I do, thanks to you. And so, I mean, you are so right. The way for us to act is to know what we have. So getting these baseline surveys done. I would love to have you come to Bahrain and for us to be able to do this. And for anyone listening to us and listening to this talk, if you have any means that can contribute towards making these baseline surveys happen, whether it's for finding funding to get Greta here or to supply boats to get us to go out, please get in touch with us. And I know that Greta has always supported my research and my you know, desire to do things. And thank you, Greta, for always being so supportive. And I really look forward to welcoming you in Bahrain sometime soon to be able to do these surveys. I'm also very aware that a lot of people would have loved to ask you questions. So perhaps if you're okay with it, I can leave your email in the description below this video and they can get in touch with you directly. And we will try and organize a live session perhaps whereby people can ask questions through a live session and you can have an interactive session with them. Is there anything you would like to add before we end this video?
That all sounds great. And the only thing I'd like to add is you guys still have some really nice coral reefs out here, but with climate change and local pressures, you will go down the same path as Florida if you're not proactive and if actions are not taken. And so I really encourage all of the countries that have jurisdiction over your coral reefs here to really step up and take care of these valuable ecosystems. And I'm more than happy to assist with training workshops or anything. Let's just do it. Get these reefs protected and not go down that Florida path and the Caribbean path, because that's, you saw the picture, very sad.
It is very sad. Thank you so much, Greta, for sharing all your knowledge with us. And we look forward to having you in another episode in the near future. So guys, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Let us know if you have any comments, any questions, and also let us know about other topics you'd like us to dive into so that you may learn more about reef ecology or any other marine ecosystem. We'll see you in the next episode. Thank you.